Yesterday, on Monday, the 17th of April, MPs debated an important petition relating to the proposed international agreement on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response put forth by the World Health Organization. The petition called for the UK government not to sign the WHO pandemic treaty unless it's explicitly been approved via public referendum. Now, the petition, which has more than 156,000 signatures, states that we want the government to commit to not signing any international treaty on the pandemic prevention and preparedness established by the World Health Organization unless this is explicitly approved by the referendum. In response to the petition provided on the 27th of May 2022, the government responded by saying, to protect lives, the economy and future generations from future pandemics, the UK government supports a new legally binding instrument to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. Now, fortunately, because the petition reached over 100,000 signatures, it was subject to debate in Westminster. So this took place yesterday, and in today's episode, I'm going to debrief what happened during the debate. I'll be sharing some snapshots and quotes from some of the speakers, some of the MPs involved, and I'll also share what can be learned and what can be done next in order to tackle these specific issues. Now, what was immediately obvious, which was a fascinating revelation, is that there was a rather packed house within the Petitions Committee room on this Monday evening. Normally, when we've witnessed other debates around similar topics connected to COVID-19, it's almost so empty that one could hear the wind blowing through the halls of the government. But today there was or Monday at least, there was a reasonable attendance across a wide base of MPs across a number of parties. Now, Nick Fletcher, who's an MP, he's a member of the Petitions Committee, opened the debate by giving an overview of the petition before essentially speaking about the achievements and edifying the WHO since its conception, but was shortly interrupted by John Speller, who's an MP, a Labour MP from Worley. As Nick Fletcher was talking about the successes of the WHO, where he specifically referenced the eradication of smallpox, John Speller went on to say, I quote, "Is the fact of the matter not that it has been a worldwide vaccination program that has enabled us to achieve that? Does that not demonstrate the falseness of the anti-vax campaigns?" So before the speaker who was introducing the debate had even finished his opening gambit, we already had an interruption from an MP who was trying to smear and reduce the overall campaign as an anti-vax campaign, which is a sad reflection of the overall sentiment towards any legitimate concerns relating to any matter pertaining to the COVID-19 response. But it doesn't stop there. I'll continue to share some of the specific arguments that this particular MP made, as well as some of the counter arguments. Now, despite being interrupted, Nick Fletcher went on to say, a question that should always be asked of any organization is, how is it funded? Now, you may or may not know, but the World Health Organization gets 20% of its funding from member states as assessed contributions. That's right, just 20% from member nations. But then 80% comes from voluntary contributions, which can be voluntary additional contributions from the member states, but it's largely from the private sector and philanthropists and big industry. Now, despite this obvious interjection around scrutinizing funding sources, he didn't really go any further to imply that those funding sources may direct global health policy. But he did ask an important question at least. But despite this, he then continued to give an incredibly vague account. And remember, this is just in the opening gambit, a vague account of the legitimate concerns raised by the petition before dismissing the idea of a referendum on the subject before concluding with his final remarks. I quote, that the WHO does some wonderful work. COVID has proved what devastation a pandemic can bring. There will no doubt be another at some point, and that we need a global perspective. We are a global community, therefore what happens here can soon have a bearing across the globe. The petitioners are essentially asking whether an unelected organization should have the power to sanction countries such as the UK if they do not wish to comply. Do we have no real choice but to comply, and should the UK sign up to this treaty without a referendum? These were Nick Fletcher's closing points to summarize the nature of the petition. And of course, it doesn't stop there, at which point MP John Steller once again took to the mic, and very quickly that it was clear that his entire aim was to undermine the specific purpose of the debate and delegitimize the concerns by once again going on a smear tirade against the so-called anti-vaxxers, bringing completely irrelevant arguments into the equation, even as far-fetched as bringing Andrew Wakefield and his conclusions on the MMR vaccines into the discussion before it even had begun. No sooner had Nick Fletcher introduced the debate, and already the conversation had been smeared as conspiracy theory and an anti-vax campaign. Now, after a short spat with Andrew Bridgen, John Steller went on to say that the COVID vaccination certainly was not unproven or unsafe, and it had a huge beneficial impact across the world. Unfortunately, we have some people, a very limited number, but we all get letters on this issue, he said, who wallow in the realm of conspiracy theories. Indeed, we've just had another example referencing Andrew Bridgen's well-thought-out comments. So there you have it. In the opening moments of the debate, not only had it immediately got off track from the matter at hand, bearing in mind this discussion was about international preparedness, a pandemic treaty that supposedly would offer greater opportunities to collaborate and cooperate across the world. Yet we have this MP smearing the conversation as anti-vax conspiracy, descending into reducing the petition in such a fashion. And this, to me, is the sad state of democracy in the UK. If you happen to live in the constituency of John Steller, I feel very sorry for you, as there is nothing stellar at all about what this MP had to say on the matter. And it was a really sad state of affairs to see the debate open in such a fashion. Though he did, I will argue, wonderfully demonstrate how someone conducts themselves when they are emotionally invested into an ideological narrative rather than reason and rational debate. However, what was wonderful to see, in fantastic contrast, was that he was followed by Danny Kruger, who's an MP from Devizes, a Conservative MP from Devizes, who then calmly and rationally first acknowledged the premise, the rationale behind the treaty and the proposals before making a very well-reasoned argument as to why the treaty should be vetoed, stating, and I quote, that we should say that in a crucial respect, the UK was prepared. We thought that we knew what we would do in the event of a pandemic. We would introduce targeted isolation and targeted protection of the most vulnerable, the application of personal responsibility, not mass lockdowns, which were not part of the plan, but we threw the plan aside immediately and we went for everybody else around the world. We went for exactly what everybody else around the world was doing, or almost everyone. Never forget plucky Sweden. He went on to say that during COVID-19, we had an excess of global collaboration and not enough independence, and certainly not enough parliamentary scrutiny. That is why I am concerned, and this is his words, about the treaty and what lies beneath it. The treaty would create, via amendments to the international health regulations, the infrastructure and funding to implement changes that are being planned anyway. Those amendments are of greater concern. The proposed new regulations would hardwire into international law and our domestic policy a top-down approach to pandemics and global public health. Yes, we do need greater cooperation and strategic vision, but no, we do not need ever more centralized solutions. Danny Kruger, the MP, concluded his speech by stating that he firmly believes that the treaty and the regulations are another greater threat to parliamentary sovereignty. It's not clear whether the government will submit the treaty and the regulations to any parliamentary approval, and he believes that they should and hopes that the minister will commit to that today. Now, bear in mind the opening rationale for the petition was to call for a public referendum. It was very clearly the motion of such actions was dismissed by several MPs, but the very positive outcome was that many of the MPs shared in consensus that this should absolutely be scrutinised within Parliament and subject to parliamentary approval. And I'll talk more about why I think that's even a more favourable solution as we move on, particularly around public education and what would be required it's demonstrated within the scope of this debate how little education the MPs have had on this very matter, even though there's been very targeted campaigns to send credible materials to each of these MPs. So if you scale that out beyond the 600 or so MPs to the 60 odd million plus, then you'll see that the challenges we would be facing in the scope of a referendum. You could argue that a huge campaign could be put into that, but you would have to strongly realize the effort required. So a parliamentary debate at least, and parliamentary approval would be a solid outcome. And again, I'll come back to that. Danny Kruger was followed by Justin Madders, who's the Labour MP for Ellesmere Port and Neston, who brought in yet more conspiracy references, stating that he'd found one website referring to the WHO as globalists that drain our resources, serve our enemies, and continue working to establish a global dictatorship over everyone and everything. He went on to say that this sentiment is clearly ludicrous, as is the reference to the WHO being owned by Bill Gates or the Chinese government. Now, despite the opening gambit from Nick Fletcher around funding sources and the clear dominance of Bill Gates and and his wider organizations over the funding of the WHO, and of course, much has been written around the Chinese influence over the current leadership structure of the WHO, he flatly dismissed those concerns. Now, and the prior sentiments around globalists and such, the real problem here is in the linguistics, and it to me highlights, which I'll speak about in a minute, the Overton window and how one communicates about these ideas. The moment that inflammatory language like that is used, it shuts down debate. And he may have been trying, and I'm not defending him here, but he may have been trying to dispel these matters in order to focus the conversation on practical terms, because he did go on at least to make some reasonable points about how we can both protect our values of freedom and democracy and still work more closely with other countries in the face of any global emergency. He also signposted the weakening of the democratic process and accountability during the pandemic. But he then once again returned to the form of dismissing people's legitimate concerns about vaccine harms and diminishing any concerns about the global agendas and the Great Reset as pure conspiracy. You really do at this point have to have your eyes wide shut if you can't see that there is a global narrative shaping this overall agenda. But unfortunately, to our own detriment, it is the way that we communicate about these ideas that sometimes shut down people's minds to this very possibility. It's so far outside of the Overton window that people cannot get their head around these issues. And in some instances, actually, the arguments themselves can be won without wider reference to the kind of global structures. But in this instance, I think it is relevant to look at the general trend towards centralization on a global level and global governance. It's clearly a marked escalation following COVID-19. But what he said during his statement was very clear, that we have a number of boundaries to the Overton window, which is the limits to public discourse. And as a point of learning, this particular part of the debate and others were very valuable in terms of discerning what is required next in terms of public education, but also in terms of public discourse in the media and with MPs and other notable figures. Because until some of these key concepts are notionally accepted in the mainstream dialogue, then they're always going to be seen as outside the Overton window and easily smeared as conspiracy. So there is work to be done on how we communicate about these wider economic, political, and philosophical challenges that are very real. Now, he was then followed by Sally Ann Hart, who's a Conservative MP for Hastings and Ryan. I'm not going to summarize every MP. We'll be here all night. You may as well just watch the debate. But I want to give you a sense of what was discussed. Now, she stated that when the draft treaty is finalized, if ever, indicating how long these things might take, it will need the agreement of nearly 200 countries. And it's vital that the why, when, how, and what of the treaty and whether it's actually needed are debated, considered, and scrutinized by UK elected representatives. She went on to say, does strengthening global health governance actually require a treaty? Are there more effective ways to strengthen global health governance after COVID-19? She said that we must look at these questions and we must be wary, once again, interjecting, of conspiracy theories distorting the facts and scaring people. Again, it comes back to that point of simple reduction of the wider problems to conspiracy. I'm sure by now you're seeing a pattern. Now, she did conclude saying that transparency of debate is required to provide proper scrutiny and to put the public's mind at rest. She seemed more concerned with people being alarmed by this than actually the facts at hand. But I wonder what approach she actually took during the pandemic when everyone was being alarmist and hysterical about COVID-19. Where were the calming voices then to bring us back to a sense of logic and reason? But nonetheless, I do agree with her point that greater transparency and scrutiny is required. But it was another example of how these wider issues of centralization and global interests and the confluence of financial interests are simply dismissed as conspiracy, even when they are in plain sight and very transparent when you actually get beneath the surface. Now, fortunately, Sally-Anne was followed by MP Andrew Bridgen, who's now very well known for his criticism of global policy, the vaccine campaign, and, of course, the WHO treaty. He gave a very long and detailed account of the primary concerns posed by the treaty and the international health regulations, demonstrating quite early that he was one of the only MPs to have likely actually read the treaty and the documents relating to the treaty. In fact, when Andrew Bridgen inquired whether John Stella had read it, John Stella gave a classic politician's response and dodged the question altogether. Andrew Bridgen then began by sharing his concerns that the lessons of the previous pandemic have not yet been learned by the WHO itself, and that we are in danger of giving yet more powers to the WHO to further enable its overreach and to repeat the catastrophic mistakes. And to me, this very sentiment underpins the crux of the real issue here. The issue itself is not a pandemic treaty, but the issue is at hand is the collapse of trust in the World Health Organization and other centralized organizations following the pandemic response. The hard reality is if the WHO had operated democratically with full transparency and accountability in successfully coordinating international efforts, then I don't think any of us would be having this conversation. If you look at the difference between how the citizens of Sweden responded with trust of its own government versus how other nations responded, you can see the difference in governance and the relationship between the citizens and a state. And you can see the same between a nation state and an international body. The trust in the WHO has simply been lost. And it's not just as a result of the pandemic. This is a long, slow erosion since the WHO changed its mode of funding. Once it let private interests in the door, its fundamental nature was changed. So the real problem here was accurately summarized by Andrew Bridgen in his wonderfully crafted 20-minute uninterrupted speech. Given that most speakers only had a few minutes, he was able to speak for nearly 20 minutes without interruption, which really showed that other than Danny Kruger and perhaps one or two others, he was the only one who was really able to speak knowledgeably with any authority on the subject, which in itself speaks volumes at the lack of preparation around MPs' diligence for such a discussion. But it also begs wider questions around the overall government's, the wider UK government's understanding of what they're actually signing up to. Remember, at the beginning of this episode, the government had already stated their support for such a treaty. And we have to ask, under what basis, under what grounds had they made such an assertion? Now, following Andrew Bridgen's 20-minute speech, the cavalry then followed as the chamber emptied. It was quite clear that there was very limited counter-arguments to Andrew Bridgen, a pitiful sign that those who would have the opportunity to put across a counter-argument were unlikely to be able to do so based on any rational argument. So when I say the cavalry followed, following Andrew Bridgen and Danny Crugan's arguments. These were then positively followed by Esther McVey and Sir Christopher Chope, who both put together solid arguments against accepting the pandemic treaty, resulting in nearly 45 minutes of straight commentary from backbenchers who were in favor of the petition and its core arguments, before the frontbenchers once again took the helm and brought it back to sobriety, with Anne McLaughlin of Glasgow North SNP, who blankly refused to give way when asked by Christopher Chope, Sir Christopher Chope and Andrew Bridgen on separate occasions, which was a clear indication that she was unwilling to enter into any form of debate or to be challenged, again highlighting the difference between those who would argue on ideology versus reason. She concluded that the SNP would be in full support of the treaty. The good news is I'm not sure that many would be in full support of the SNP following the recent revelations about Sturgeon and others within the party. But that's for another day. She was then followed by Preet Kaur Gill from Birmingham, Edgbaston, a Labour member who essentially dismissed any concerns that had been raised about the treaty and went on to give a speech right out of the global narrative playbook and showed clear alignment to the centralized technocracy in her attitudes towards and words towards the matter. So much so that I legitimately had to check whether she was a representative of the WHO or UN. She could have been an ambassador for either. More concerning, however, is that I believe that her words are a deeper reflection of the Labour Party as a whole under Keir Starmer, who has unashamedly aligned himself with the central global organisations such as the WEF and the Trilateral Commission. Now, I know to many former Labour voters this is of great concern, but still Starmer has garnered a wide amount of loyalty under the Labour Party and has a stiff control through the whip of the wider MPs. So if this did come to a parliamentary vote, I would be very concerned about Labour and their voting position on this treaty, which could potentially accelerate its pathway through Parliament if it did become subject to parliamentary approval. I say this as a political neutral, but it is a concern of mine in terms of the way that the Labour government has approached COVID-19 and related matters. Not that the Conservatives or any other party has done a particularly strong job, with only a few exceptions of individual MPs who have taken the matters to their own hands. Now, the final speaker of the session was the Minister of State, Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Anne-Marie Trevelyan. And it wasn't clear her role, but she's clearly a government minister representing the UK government and perhaps involved in the negotiation of the pandemic treaty. She confirmed that despite disagreement between MPs whether the treaty would be legally binding, that whether the treaty is agreed under Article 19 or Article 21, both would be legally binding as a matter of international law, though she did state clearly that this would still not undermine national sovereignty. That point is a point of contention due to the vagaries of the language within both documents, which I'll talk more in the conclusion of this episode. She then went on to talk about how over the next year, UK officials will shape and negotiate the pandemic treaty text with other WHO members to ensure that it delivers on our priorities, working towards, and here's the emphasis, faster and more equitable access to affordable vaccines, treatments and tests, strengthening collaboration on scientific research and development, including clinical trials and data sharing. Clearly, the emphasis throughout this entire conversation is on the big D word, drugs. You could say the big V word as a specific drug. But drugs are a clear emphasis not only of this conversation, but of the overall priorities of the WHO, and that's indicative in its funding structure. She also talked about how the need for improved collaboration and coordination across the human, animal, and environmental health sectors to control threats on zoonotic diseases and other threats. And again, we have to ask ourselves, where is this fear coming from? Whilst, yes, we have now faced a challenge and there have been other challenges, the reality is there have been 3 major outbreaks of a pandemic nature in the last 100 years. And even those are debatable in terms of magnitude and scope. So why the need for such level of resource into a preparedness initiative? And then finally, she went on to talk about the strong partnership with institutions across the private sector, including the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which is a very innocent sounding title, CEPI as it's known, but is another vaccine-orientated organization, as is Gavi, who are closely linked to this overall process. And finally, she talked about the investment of over 230 million to support the development of new COVID vaccines, including prior vaccines, including the AstraZeneca vaccine released by the University of Oxford, which she praised for saving lives across the world, despite that being the first vaccine almost in every country that pulled vaccines to be taken from the market. She glossed over any questions about transparency of the influence of China. She glossed over any question about the need to examine lessons from COVID and the issues surrounding the vaccines. And it leaves me baffled in terms of how we particularly challenge these narratives within senior ministers. However, there are some very clear conclusions, which I'll share with you now. And I believe that the biggest gain from watching this debate in its entirety is a very clear path ahead in terms of how to move forward to tackle this particular issue. The reality is the treaty itself is not going to go away by itself, neither are the international health regulations. And as I stated during the course of this podcast, neither by themselves, okay, if negotiated effectively, are necessarily dramatic, would necessarily have dramatic ramifications. I say that on the basis that it's not concluded, it's not a foregone conclusion, and it's yet to be ratified. But the bigger issue, as I've stated, is the nature of the role of the WHO. If it was not for the WHO, neither of these documents would probably have the same significance as they do today. So we've got wider issues in tackling both. We've got narrow issues in terms of tackling the pandemic treaty and the health amendments, but we've got wider issues in terms of tackling the specific nature of the WHO. So what can we conclude? Firstly, number one, that the treaty and the international health regulations are in draft form and can still be influenced. We should take hope in that from day one. The contradictions and the vagaries in the language used within these documents clearly need to be cleared up to appease any concerns about loss of national sovereignty. There are some very specific articles and clauses that either need to be amended or deleted to give this clarity, because it's clear that this will be internationally binding, but to what extent, and does that become UK law? And also, what extent does it affect the UK sovereignty, and to what extent is those powers being transferred from guidance to mandates or directives of the WHO? All of these points are fundamental points that are yet to be fully concluded, and we need to be heavily influencing these points across the board. And this is an international effort because, of course, every country is at the negotiating table. And if we have a joined up approach across the world, we can quite clearly begin to influence the final draft of the treaty. Secondly, on that point, joining the negotiation table. We need to find out who within the UK government is responsible for negotiating on behalf of the United Kingdom and ensure that the lines of communication are open to deliver transparency. It's all very well communicating via our MPs. They will be able to some degree influence the direction of this conversation, but we really need to know who are the negotiating bodies within the UK government, and similarly with other nations across the world, so that we can influence the most appropriate people. Thirdly, civil society organizations. What degree can the public be involved in any process of negotiation or consultation? We need to be able to press for this as a matter of urgency. This cannot be a closed door negotiation left to governments to negotiate on behalf of the public. If it is on behalf of the public interest, then we need to put our own interests first and make sure that we also have a seat at the negotiation table, or at least a voice that is heard. Fourthly, a referendum is not likely the best mechanism. Would the public really pay attention? Would it set precedent for other referendums? The broad consensus is that a parliamentary debate and vote is a positive outcome to bring adequate scrutiny and give the UK the option to opt out of the treaty if it chooses to do so. And from a negotiation point of view, from an education point of view, it gives us a smaller number of people to influence the outcome of that vote if it does materialize, rather than trying to influence the millions of the population in the United Kingdom, who we know over the last few years have been rather in favor of what has just happened, despite the catastrophic impacts. So pursuing the commitment for the government to not only discuss the treaty and amendments in Parliament, but to put it to a vote. This should be a very concrete set of actions from those like myself and other activists who are pursuing this particular campaign. 5, the Overton window. I've spoken about this, but the matters of financial conflicts of interest, globalized agendas, centralization of powers, and the acceptance that vaccines can cause serious harm are seemingly still outside of the Overton window, which demonstrates where the focus needs to be in order to raise wider awareness to normalize conversations around these matters amongst public discourse. That's going to take some work. It's going to take some pressure of the media, but we're going to need to bring these conversations into the public sphere. Without that, these will easily continue to be reduced to conspiracy. So we need credible and legitimate sources to start bringing these conversations to the forefront. Number 6, lessons learned. We do need to destroy the illusion of lack of preparedness. The catastrophic impact can be fully attributed in many ways to throwing out the pandemic playbook. The data is demonstrating this clearly, that those who followed a more traditional approach to pandemic management, such as Sweden, have fared much better in almost every single measure. So looking at this preparedness argument is important for a number of reasons, as is really scrutinizing the approach to COVID-19 endorsed by the WHO, because they are at the heart. If they're at the heart of the coordination and they want to be at the heart of any further coordination, then they need to be held accountable for the mistakes and the harms and the illegal approaches in many ways to the pandemic response. Supporting the premise of international cooperation, coordination, and preparedness. Now, in principle, this is a positive thing. And in fact, there is the consensus across the MPs, even those who stand against the proposal, all seem in alignment with the idea of international cooperation, coordination, and preparedness. And it makes sense. Let's break it down on a local level. Let's say we're running an activist campaign here in Bournemouth, where I live, and also in my previous city of Bristol. Of course, we'd want to collaborate between the cities and share information, but we'd also want to localize given the different cultures and demographics within each city. So we can collaborate internationally, but we also must have the ability to localize and full sovereignty without any mandate or directive from some centralized authority. But it doesn't mean that we wouldn't share data across the world. Of course, that's something that would need to happen. So agreeing in principle with some of these premises, I think, will enable us to deflate the kind of counter argument, because we can all see we're actually coming from the same point of view. We would want international cooperation, but not at the expense of our own freedom, democracy, and national sovereignty. So both of these things can be achieved, which I think is a very strong positive that we can take forward. Now, the question of whether any such coordination should be undertaken by the WHO is a big one, and I would say highly questionable. What are the alternatives? There's no alternatives even being discussed. Is there an alternative to greater centralization? How could a new, for instance, fully independent, decentralized body be set up to support collaboration, to avoid the threat of greater directives or even legally binding requirements? We have to ask these bigger questions about, is there an independent body or series of bodies that would be better suited than the WHO to undertaking this activity? And this brings us to another point around pandemic preparedness as an industry. As I mentioned, we've only had 3 major outbreaks in the last 100 years, and there is little evidence to suggest that such vast resources would be required, because, of course, this treaty and amendments are seeking billions in funding. A huge amount of national resources and private resources pooled into this WHO initiative. And it seems quite clearly that a new industry driven by the pharmaceutical healthcare complex is being created here. And we have to ask ourselves, firstly, what is the probability of a naturally occurring global health emergency of this kind in a modern world again in the near future? Heavy scrutiny is clearly required here to burst the bubble of the idea of continued threat and continued threat of a crisis. This is a major point. And again, in terms of debate and evidence, this is something that we need to center on. Next, an independent global inquiry, particularly focusing on the WHO's role in the pandemic response. And I would argue even as much as that a global inquiry should precede any signature, any approval of any treaty or amendments. How can we move forward without first learning the lessons, as Andrew Bridgen said? So the WHO's role in the pandemic response needs to be critically analyzed, from its critical failings to the lack of accountability and transparency, to the prioritization of private partnerships over public health, the normalization of harmful pandemic policies, its role in the vaccine developments and subsequent harms, the failure to investigate the lab leak, the undemocratic re-election of Tedros as the Director General, the fact that the WHO failed to take action at the beginning of the pandemic to limit its spread. All of these things seriously undermine the WHO's credibility. Surely giving more powers to a failing and flawed international body of this nature to coordinate efforts as a single source of truth with possibly legally binding ramifications is a very, very bad idea. So I think, yes, we can argue on the terms of the treaty itself and the amendments, but I think there's a bigger question that needs to be asked around the legitimacy and credibility on an ongoing basis of the WHO. So the next point is around scrutinizing the WHO. It points towards the wider need to scrutinize the inner workings of the WHO, its focus, its operations. Is it time for total reform or replacement of the WHO? These questions should be preceding any pandemic treaty. And I'd argue at a very minimum that a full restructuring involving a change in leadership with a democratic process and transformation of the funding structure is required as an absolute minimum. Remember, up to 80% of the WHO's funding is from private sources, demonstrating the corporate capture or the corporate influence and possible bloated or corrupted nature of the WHO. These, to me, are much bigger concerns and really underpin the core challenge. But as I mentioned, these things are outside of the Overton window right now. You know, the WHO is treated with the same revere and sanctity as vaccines themselves, and the idea that vaccines are all safe and effective. There's no nuance to the discussion. So again, it comes back to how do we use education and evidence and rational argument to bring these points within the Overton window, the points of discussion, and into public discourse. And then lastly, how do we tackle the dominance of big pharma within healthcare and global health governance? What percentage of funding can be linked back to pharmaceuticals? How much of the WHO's funding is from big pharma directly or attributable to institutions like Gavi, CEPI, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and others? It's very clear where the focus is. And as I said it already, it's drugs, drugs, drugs. And I asked this morning on Twitter, how many notable successes over the past decade can the WHO attribute to non-pharmaceutical interventions or measures? It's really quite clear that this is a shop front for the pharmaceutical industry. And we have to ask, what is the most effective way to actually move towards a world of health? You know, the WHO is talking about a One Health approach. And under the current setup and leadership and focus, I'd be very concerned about what that means with an increasingly drugged and drug-dependent world for every particular niggle or problem. How do we actually create a truly healthy society? Would you trust the WHO to be in charge of directing global health policy after what you've witnessed over the last few years? I certainly would not. So I've given you a long account of what went on and what can be learned and how we can use some of these things within the course of the next few months as we progress towards the ratification of this treaty and eventual approval or rejection within each of the nation states. And there's work to do across every nation. But to me, I feel very clear now about where we need to focus. And these concluding remarks hopefully give you an indication of what that focus could be. But I'm very hopeful that a favorable outcome can be negotiated over the next few months, and as we move towards the deadline date for this treaty and approval. How we tackle the wider issues, that's a much bigger question, but I'll be back on the podcast in the near future to share my ideas on that matter. So if you found this episode valuable, please do share this conversation. I've got massive shadow bans on Facebook and other channels. It's gone are the days where I could reach 1,000+ people live at a time. I really need your help to get these conversations out there. This debate last night, if you looked at the official numbers on the WHO debate on YouTube, there was, I think, a maximum of 100 people watching at any one time. We had a Zoom room of 100 people watching it live, so we at least doubled those numbers. We got 70 people watching this one live, but I need your help to get this out there. People need to understand what's going on here, and I really hope the Pandemic Podcast in its current form can help you to do that. So please hit the share button, and we'll together raise awareness of these critical issues. Thanks again for watching this, and watch this space for more information on the latest developments of the pandemic treaty and other related matters. If you'd like to join our mailing list, head over to danastingregory.com/pandemic. That's danastingregory.com/pandemic, and join the Pandemic Podcast mailing list for future updates. Thanks again for tuning in.